Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those who are listening. My name is Myrtle October, and I am the founder of Threat to Thriving Inc., which is an organization set to reduce recidivism through advocacy, through prevention workshops, as well as events that bring awareness and also raise funding for this very important issue in our society. We have a lot of reasons why we should be concerned as a people, as our families. If we can think about it, if it were your child, what would you want and what would you want to do? And this does not just hit African American families, this is hitting families. And very much so the family of African Americans, but not only that, broader than that are all the men that are from the age of 18 and up. Our practices are specific to local jails, local county jails in Florida, because of course we have to start somewhere, right? We don't want to talk about everywhere, but Florida has the highest jail rate on earth, according to prisonpolicy.org, on earth. We have 7 continents. And of those 7 continents, Florida houses the most people on earth. And that is a problem when they don't have also the practices for reentry. And I know locally, right here in Lee County, reentry programs are non existent. They are very menial and minuscule. Even if they do exist, you have to know someone to know someone to know someone. And it is very difficult, even as a business. I've done everything I can to get myself set up as an actual business, and even I'm having a trouble to do it. So, someone coming out of a local jail to try to find housing, a job, and the resources, they say that it's available, but it is very much unavailable because I've made over 50 to 100 calls and it just continuously hits a wall each time. So we are here to help people. We are here to help people to re-enter. We have 3 programs: re-entry, which is consulting and coaching for families who want to help their family member. We don't work directly with the incarcerated individual or a re-entering individual. We work with the family. So if you are a family member and you want to help someone who's coming out of jail and help their transition to be better, then you are someone who would need our services, consultation and coaching. As well, we have prevention workshops where we come into different facilities such as libraries or schools, and we have a conversation and we talk to or churches about ways to prevent. We also in those moments also raise awareness and funding. In addition to that, our third program is murder mystery dinners. Murder mystery dinners, or Myrtle mystery dinners, are set to be able to raise awareness and funding, but also provide an educational and entertaining environment for people to get an understanding of what incarceration practices looked like long ago to present. So we are coming to our event in May 25th, 2024. That event is at FGCU, and it is at 4 o'clock. The reception starts at 4 o'clock and goes to 5. It's orders and reception as well presentations. And then from 6 to 8 is the actual murder mystery dinner begins with a 4 course meal. And at that time, you'll get an opportunity to hear my story as well, the story of others within that play set, 5 scenes. And so we're doing that at least 3 times a year. And that is to help people who may not want to really engage in this kind of conversation in a formal way. It gives them an opportunity to be entertained as well, have an opportunity to just understand something they may not understand completely and wholly. And so today, our Incarceration Practices 101 begins to talk about the 1700s and what began those practices and how did we get here. So, how did we get here? The 1700s was the beginning of all of that. And so if you look at the law, there's the Piracy Act of 1717, of which that this event that's coming up in May will be based in the 1700s, and it'll be exhibits to help you to follow that storyline. That timeline does have a very, I would say, ugly history. but yet still it is history. And we need to acknowledge it as such so that way we can move forward and grow. If we do not look at the past just a tiny bit, we will not go forward well, or it's hard to understand why and how we got here. And so, in order to understand why and how we got here, we must first get an opportunity to look at the picture from the past. And so, the picture from the past is about the invention of incarceration. And from that, I have an article to share with you today. It's from the Daily Jester. And one of this is a database that graduate students would use, or undergrad students use to help them write their papers, as well for the intellectual who wants to do research. It's an awesome, awesome, awesome library database for intellectually curious people. So this article was written in 2022, March 18th, 2022, and it first appeared in Knowledgeable magazine, and the article is by Greg Miller. It's about a 12-minute read, and we're going to go ahead and dive right into this article because what it does is gives you a little bit of an insight on what it is that what invented incarceration. I feel like this article really sums up a beautiful way how a Piracy Act of 1717 began and what caused all of these things. And so we're going to go right into that and give you 12 minutes so that way you can understand a little more about the invention of incarceration. So we didn't just arrive here, but the prisons have been a controversial since the beginnings of the late 1700s. And so why do they keep failing to live up to the expectations? Well, let's listen. As a young girl growing up in Northern California, Ashley Rubin dutifully said her prayers each night before going to sleep. She routinely included what she now sees as a strange request that all bad people go to prison. Here's the 8-year-old child who is not really old enough to understand the significance of any of this, but knows that sending people to prison is just what we do, says Rubin, who's now a sociologist specializing in U.S. prison history at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. The idea of punishing criminals with time in prison is so ingrained in our culture, she says, that most people assume that prisons have always existed. But they haven't. For most of Western history, long term incarceration wasn't used as punishment. And many countries even had rules against it. Rubin tells Knowable, the idea of confining people for long periods of time as punishment was really quite revolutionary. Her research involves combining archives for records, letters, and other documents on the early history of prisons. And along with other scholars, she argues that prisons, as we now know them, first arose in the nascent United States shortly after the Revolutionary War. Jails used for short term confinement have a much longer history in Europe and around the world. So, like I was saying, our practices are specific to the local jails. Those were the beginnings of all of this. A lot of times, if you meet someone from state, federal, or even like a juvenile detention center, those practices are a little less heavy or ugly in the terms of how they're treated. The local jails jail these people and they put them in confinement, no windows, no connections, no people, no talking, no connecting. But in the other jails, and that was a little bit of drama for you, but honestly, it really is that when it goes to federal prison, they get yard time conjugal visits, meaning they get to have even intimate opportunities of consummation with their spouse. Okay, so and also they get to meet with cellmates and things like sometimes they're in there with another cellmate. They're probably going out to play in the yard. They actually eat together, and that may happen in the actual local jail too. So, but nascent, I wanted to just talk about that adjectives. It's a process of organization just coming into existence and beginning to display signs of future potential. So just beginning. So just in case you didn't know what that word was, I didn't. So I wanted to make sure you knew. And I'm always a person who looks up words. I don't act or pretend to know something I don't know. I will always research that with you as we continue to go through incarceration practices all the way through our series. So we're going to go through our series 101 to 112. So we'll have one every month, 101, 102, and all the way through 112. And I will share all of the research that I've done during my time in school, as well current research that is being done now. So we'll always have something very good to talk about, and we'll go through these pieces, and we won't keep you longer than 15 minutes. We'll definitely try to watch the clock and keep you less than 20 minutes. We'll say 20 because this article is 12 minutes and I've stopped to talk already because that will happen. So we'll do 20 minutes. Just to give you an overview. But we also have that event in May. So I want to prepare people for the 1700s event. Again, it is exciting and fun, and we're educating you, entertaining you, but we're going to make sure you still understand what it is and why we're doing this. So here we go. So we'll go back to that sentence just so you have an idea. So her research involves combining archives for records, letters, and other documents on the early history of prisons, along with other scholars. She argues that prisons, as we know them, first arose in the nascent United States. So the beginning parts of the United States. United States is a new continent, new country. Shortly after the Revolutionary War, jails used for short term confinement have a much longer history in Europe and around the world. So other places had started, but United States had um, a different way of doing things. Prisons were controversial from the start, and over the last 230 years, the public conversation about them in the United States has taken many turns. At first, Rubin says they were billed as humanitarian achievement, a more effective and more humane way to punish criminals than corporal or capital punishment. But their purported goals have shifted with time, with varying degrees of emphasis placed on protecting the public. Okay, that's been that part. We want to pause there for a second. It's been about protecting the public. Just keep that in mind, okay, as we're continuing this incarceration practices 101. But their purported goals have shifted with time, with varying degrees of emphasis placed on protecting the public by taking criminals out of circulation, punishing them for their crimes, rehabilitating them into better citizens, and serving as a deterrent to other would be lawbreakers. So it's to kind of make an example of you. When prisons fail to rehabilitate criminals or reduce crime, or when they end up costing more than the public wants to pay, conversation tends to be about the particular issue and not about the inherent limitations of prisons as an institution, says Rubin. I'm not an abolitionist, but I can't look at the history of prisons and not think, why are we still using them? Rubin thinks we have unrealistic expectations when it comes to prisons, expecting them to do too many and often contradictory things. She spoke with Knowable, which is a magazine, about the early history of prisons and how it could inform current discussions about prison reform. This conversation has been condensed and edited for clarity. Weren't people getting locked up way before the late 1700s? I've seen it in movies. Yes, but those were jails, not prisons. There were, for example, workhouses in England and the Netherlands in the 16th century that held a big mix of people, including vagrants, debtors, and prostitutes, even orphans in some cases. People who had done minor things or hadn't necessarily been convicted of a crime or were being held awaiting trial, or until they paid a fine or for other administrative purposes, of which local jails, that is what's happening. If you go sit at court, which is public, anyone can go to court and sit there and listen. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. All right, some scholars have argued that those were the first prisons, but in my view, they were more similar to what we could call a jail today. Jail is basically a short term holding cell, not a place of punishment. And we've had that throughout history. It is a place of punishment, I'd like to retort. Anyway, if you think of prison in the way we use the word today, the idea is pretty new. I would define it as a place designed for punishment of people who have been convicted of typically serious offenses, and their punishment is long term confinement, usually more than a year. Before prisons existed, how were criminals punished? Question was asked. In England and colonial America, the primary form of punishment was capital punishment. Pretty much everything was a capital offense. including moral offenses like adultery, religious offenses like breaking the Sabbath. Authorities might let it slide the first time, and they handed out a lot of pardons to prevent the system from killing everybody. Over time, that softened so that less serious offenses were typically punished with corporal punishment like whipping or branding using on the cheek or hand, or to show how close you came to getting executed. You would be sentenced to spend an hour standing on the scaffold where they hanged people with noose around your neck. In the 16th and 17th century, banishment was also a punishment, and that's where we'll get into the transportation portion. I think that this article is going to go into that a little more. Banishment was also a punishment. In the 17th century, fines were also widely used, often in combination with corporal punishment. So, when and where did the first prisons arise? The first actual prison is the Massachusetts State Prison that opened in 1785, just after the American Revolution. Then came Connecticut in 1790 and Pennsylvania in 1794. Those are the first three state prisons in the world. So we got 1785 was Massachusetts, and Connecticut was 1790, Pennsylvania was 1794. Those are the first three state prisons. So again, we're now going away from jail and we're talking about prisons, okay? What was the rationale that led to their founding? I would say the most immediate reasons was that, in the view of social reformers, politicians, and other influential people at the time, the existing punishments just weren't working to deter crime. Capital and corporal punishment were also seen as inhumane. But I would say deterrence was the main reason. Big concern at the time was that the existing punishments were actually causing more crime. Let's take that out because I didn't want that. The fear was that people would go to an execution and get bloodlust and want to go kill people themselves. Prison advocates argued that people would hear scary stories about prisons, and the thought of being locked away from friends and family would terrify them into never committing a crime. Simultaneously, there was this movement to reform jails because the conditions were just terrible, grotesque even. There was a lot of frightening and fighting and corruption, and they were hot spots for diseases. Those ideas kind of came together. The desire for a new type of punishment and the need to reform the jails and pave the way for prisons as we now know them. Was rehabilitation ever part of the goal? That was another part of it. Prison advocates also thought that incarceration would be good because it would remove people from their bad environments. If you have a family that's not treating you well, or you've run away from an apprenticeship and fallen in with people who are a bad influence and you have access to alcohol, the idea was that they just needed to remove you from the environment and put you into a good, clean, moral environment. So I think some things often start with good intentions. And if you think of this and you hear it, you say, okay, good intentions were some these advocates were thinking about ways that they could help people. All the early prisons for over a century involved hard labor. They thought criminals are lazy, so let's teach them discipline and put them to work. But there was also a little bit of recognition that people just hadn't been trained in a particular vocation, so they needed to be trained to do the work. There were additional educational and religious overtones. So if people were illiterate, they were taught to write and they were given moral guidance, which oftentimes was religious. Religion is a lot of things, huh? So they have a picture here of a factory, and I'll go ahead and try to post that later and this article as well in the comments. Was there much public debate about prisons in those early days? Oh yeah, there was a huge debate that went on from the 1700s into the 1820s. So the 1780s into the 1820s. The original question was, should we have capital and corporal punishment, or should we have prisons? Who had pro capital punishment? People arguing that prison wasn't harsh enough. And you had pro prison people arguing that prison was more severe than capital punishment and that it's better in that way. But at the same time, the prison advocates were kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouths, trying to convince others that prison wasn't torture and to combat the common refrain that humans are social creatures and you can't deprive them of social intercourse. That was a major concern. What happens when you put human beings in long-term captivity? Capacity. How long were sentences in the early days of prisons? They typically were about a couple of years. The average wasn't that different from today, interestingly enough, except that there weren't very long sentences of life sentences. The longest sentences would be like 8 to 12 years in the early days. How did solitary confinement begin? The first prisons were mostly dormitory like facilities. They were cleaner and better run than jails had been, so they were much better at reducing. But by the 1800s or 1810s, people were starting to become concerned that putting prisons together was allowing them to infect each other with their criminality, that people would go to prison and become savvier in their criminality. In the first generation of prison, solitary confinement was sometimes used as punishment, but at the beginning of discussions about the second generation of prisons, many wanted to use solitary confinement for all prisons. Was that controversial at the time, they asked? There was an epic debate about the humaneness of all this got going in the 1820s. It focused on two prisons with different approaches to the problem of how to use solitary confinement and not kill prisoners or make them go insane. At Auburn State Prison in New York, prisoners worked in a large workshop during the day, but they weren't allowed to talk or even look at each other. They were socially but not physically isolated. In the evenings, they were confined to tiny individual cells. In contrast, at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, prisoners were kept in solitary confinement around the clock, but they had rooms that were big enough for them to work in and access to a small private yard for fresh air. They were allowed to talk with prison staff and receive occasional visits from penal reformers in the local community, but they were not allowed contact with family, friends, or other prisoners. And there's a picture there too of the Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. It was built in the 1820s, provided one or two competing models of how early prisons should be run. It's from the Library Company of Philadelphia, so you'll get to see that later. The Auburn system won out. The decision ultimately hinged on not on which system was more humane, but on the perception that the Auburn system was more cost effective and profitable. It used smaller cells, which were cheaper to construct, and factory style labor, which was generally considered more efficient. So Auburn wasn't actually more profitable, but people believed it was. By the 1850s, every state except for Pennsylvania had adopted the Auburn system. At that point, there's just no more controversy. Prisons were here to stay. And they asked the question, how would you characterize the public debate over prisons today? It's a weird time. It's very messy. We're in this moment of transition. On the one hand, activism is big right now, and there are calls to defund the police, more public talks, big books getting published about abolishing prisons. There are all discussions in mainstream newspapers about how abolition is more complicated than just getting rid of prisons. It requires reimagining society in a way that addresses the major oppressive structures that contribute to criminality, and necessitates punishment. We are seeing more people in the mainstream talk about abolition of various criminal justice institutions than I had expected to see in my lifetime. The biggest lesson of prison history is how prisons keep failing us, and yet we keep using them anyway. And that's by Ashley Rubin, sorry. On the other hand, that's still a small group overall, and we're experiencing massive polarization. At the same time that prison about abolitionists are making headlines, other folks, mostly Trumpian Republicans, but also some self-identified conservatives criminologists argue that we need more prisons to keep society safe from violent criminals. Anytime there is an increase in crime rates, they see it as evidence that we need more incarceration rather than looking at what type of crime we're talking about and what's really causing it. And that's what Threat to Thriving is all about. How can the history of prison inform discussion? I think that the biggest lesson of prison history is how prisons keep failing us and yet we keep using them anyway. We're always at an overlay of optimistic idea about what they could accomplish, but we kind of are okay with it when they're just barely doing what they're supposed to, or even when they have massively failed. We keep thinking we can fix it. We convince ourselves that the problem isn't prison per se, it's the model of prison we're using, or the way we've implemented it, or the resources we gave it, or the people who are running it. But we haven't looked at the history of prison and really taken seriously what's causing all these failures. We haven't looked at the inherent limitations of prison and whether they can actually accomplish all the goals we set for them. We tell people who run prisons to keep their prisoners and staff safe and healthy, but to do it within a budget and certain rules that may not be realistic. For example, we tell people who run prisons to make sure the prison experience is not exactly fun, and maybe to make sure prison feels like punishment, and maybe to rehabilitate them, and definitely to keep prisoners inside so they can't hurt people on the outside. Basically, we tell prisons to do too many things, and it's not likely we can give them all the tools they need to do any of these things. If we want to make prisons better, we need to think more carefully about what we actually want prisons to do. Give consistent messages about that and stop piling on conflicting goals that make it impossible for prisons to live up to our overlay high expectations. So that's the conversation you think we should be having. Honestly, I think the conversation we should be having is not one about prisons. If we're talking about prisons as a tool for rehabilitation, you can have the best designed prison and it be virtually meaningless if people released from prison face the types of challenges on the outside that they face now. The inability to receive various kinds of governmental assistance, prohibition from getting certain types of jobs, including jobs they were trained for while in prison, difficulty getting most jobs because of background checks, and discrimination against people with criminal records, as slew of fees and fines they still need to pay. Not to mention the lack of help in finding a place to live and transitioning to the outside. Oh, the outside world. They have a very tight rope to walk to not return to prison. If we want to prevent crime, we're talking about punishment. We're also having the wrong conversation. If deterrence worked well for crime reduction, we would have more evidence that it works. But we only have weak and mixed evidence. If you want to prevent crime, you have to intervene before the crime happens. I think that right conversation to be having is one about social policies and the things that actually work to prevent crime. Child care, shoring up health care, early childhood nutrition, all these things have nothing to do with crime directly, but benefit everyone in society. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about behind the bars and the invention of mass incarceration. Prisons were once considered a sign of progress, a victory for public health that was more humane than disease ridden, overcrowded jails and the harsh physical punishments meted out on the town green. Yet today, prisons face a legitimacy crisis and are considered by many policymakers and reformers as a bloated, inhumane institutions. How did we get here? What's reasonable to ask of prisons, and do they ever work as intended? How is incarceration experienced by those who are imprisoned? Watch the discussion with formerly incarcerated writer and socialist to learn how the history of prisons can inform our understanding of mass incarceration today. So you can go to see that on JSTOR or daily.jstor.org. And you get to get more information about that. And there's a lot more articles that we'll go over in the next next time together. So I really want to say thank you. Definitely don't want to go over 30 minutes here. So I just want to say thank you for tuning in. This is Myrtle October. I want you to go to threat2thrivinginc.org. As well, we have a hotline. It's 1-855-5THREAT. That's 1-855-THREAT. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and continue to have a beautiful, blessed day.